Hello folks, and welcome back to another Know Your Ship episode. In this week's episode, I'll be covering the Dunkerque Class Battlecruisers. These ships had a rather short operational career, so this episode will be a little bit more on the technical and diplomatic sides of the story. So without much further hesitation, let's get going. The story of the Dunkerque Class Battlecruisers starts with a series of design studies started in 1925. The first design studies were meant to counter the new Trento-class cruisers that Italy had just built. These initial ships displaced 17,500 tons and would have been armed with two quad 305mm guns mounted at the front of the ship and armored to resist 203mm shells. However, these ships could not resist fire from the older Italian battleships and were thus not accepted for production. The next two designs involved 37,000-ton ships, one a battleship and one a battlecruiser. The battlecruiser would have been 254 meters long, had a 30.5 meter beam, with three quad 305mm turrets, two in the front and one aft. Armor would have been between 220 to 280 millimeters in thickness and would have been capable of 33 knots. The battleship design would have had twin 406mm turrets on a 235 meter hull. Armor would have been thicker, but the ship was slower, having only a 27 knot max speed. None of these ships were laid down for a couple of reasons, either the lack of appropriately sized docks or that there were negotiations over further naval restrictions. Everything changed, however, in 1929 when the Germans laid down the first Deutschland-class Panzerschiffs. These ships packed guns that made them extremely difficult and tricky for a cruiser to deal with, and were generally fast enough to evade almost all capital ships in Europe, the exception at the time being the HMS Hood and the two renowned class battlecruisers. The French immediately started work on a design that would counter these Deutschland-class ships, and that's how the Dunkerque class came about. The Dunkerque was ordered on the 26th of October 1932 and laid down on December the 25th, 1932. The Dunkerque was significantly larger than the ships that they were designed to counter, coming in at more than twice the displacement, because France still had to consider countering the older Italian battleships. The Dunkerque was the first ship in the class. She would be 215.1 meters long, 31.1 meter beam, and a draft of 8.7 meters. The ships would also be armed with the larger 330mm guns in two quad turrets, giving the ships the firepower to deal with the older Italian battleships. The 330mm guns were capable of delivering a 560kg armor-piercing shell with a muzzle velocity of 870 meters a second out to a maximum range of 41,700 meters at 35 degrees elevation, which gave the shells a rather flat trajectory. This was good for hitting belt armor, but it wasn't so good at hitting deck armor. It could also deliver a 522kg high-explosive shell with a muzzle velocity of 885 meters a second, out to a maximum range of 40,600 meters. Rate of fire was pretty decent, between 22 and 40 seconds per salvo. The barrels had a lifespan of 250 rounds before needing to be replaced. The 330mm guns were placed into quad turrets, but were grouped together in pairs. Think of it as having sort of two twin turrets put together. The reason the guns were mounted in pairs rather than individually, like in the King George V class battleships, was because the Dunkerque class had insufficient beam and could not fit a large enough barbette to accommodate four guns mounted individually. The pairs of guns were spaced out in the turret by a bulkhead to prevent both sets of guns being knocked out by one hit. The two turrets themselves were placed 27 meters apart from each other to prevent one hit from knocking out both turrets. The turrets could traverse at 5 degrees a second and elevate at 6 degrees per second, meaning it would take 36 seconds to traverse 180 degrees and just 5 seconds to reach maximum elevation. The forward placement of the guns provided certain tactical advantages. It would allow the Dunkerque to fire at a ship directly ahead of it with all of its firepower while maintaining the smallest possible profile. A useful feature for a ship that was designed to chase a commerce raider that most likely would have fled at the first sign of a larger capital ship. However, the quad guns did have their disadvantages too. Its arc of fire was more limited since it could not fire directly backwards, and the guns were also placed too close together, and so when the shells were fired they would create a certain wake that would create excessive dispersion. The secondary guns aboard the Dunkerque class ships were made up of 130mm dual-purpose guns. These guns were mounted in 3 quad and 2 dual mounts. In the anti-surface mode, the 130mm guns fired a 33.4kg semi-armor-piercing shell. Muzzle velocity was 800 meters a second, out to a range of 20,800 meters. In the anti-aircraft role, the guns fired a 29.5 kilogram time-fused high-explosive round to a max ceiling of 12,000 meters at a 75-degree elevation. Rate of fire was poor at only 10 rounds a minute. These guns were quite unsatisfactory. For the anti-surface role, the guns were deemed to have not enough punching power, and in the anti-aircraft role, they just didn't have that rate of fire to deal with attacking aircraft. Furthermore, the quad mounts themselves had frequent problems, mostly related to the loading system, which was liable to defects. In terms of anti-aircraft guns, the Dunkirk was definitely on the light side, especially when compared to the ships in the Royal Navy and the US Navy. Not only that, but the guns weren't nearly as good as, say, the 40mm Bofors mounted to other Allied vessels. The 37mm M1933 guns were mounted in dual mounts, with a total of 5 dual mounts on the Dunkirk. Rate of fire was again a rather low 30 to 42 rounds a minute. The Dunkerque class was also fitted with 8 quad 13.2mm machine guns. Rate of fire was around 250 to 300 rounds a minute with a 15-round magazine, although if a 30-round magazine was used, it could go up to 450 rounds a minute. On other French ships that were eventually rearmed by Allied nations, the 20mm Oerlikon largely replaced these 13.2mm machine guns. The Dunkirk's armor was pretty good. It was an all-or-nothing scheme. The citadel was 126 meters long, which was roughly 60% of the total length of the ship. The belt armor was 225mm thick, which was designed to resist fire from German 280mm guns. The main deck was 115mm under the superstructure and 125mm under the turrets. There was another layer of deck armor, 40mm in thickness, that lay under the main deck to provide further protection from plunging fire. The conning tower had 270mm armor on its face and sides, 220mm on the back, and 150 to 160mm on the top. The main barbettes had 310mm of armor, and the turret armor itself consisted of a 330mm face, 250mm on the side, and 345mm on the rear of A turret and 335mm on the rear of B turret, and 150mm on the roof of the turret. The Strasbourg differed from the Dunkirk in having a bit more armor, in particular belt armor. This was because the Strasbourg was laid down after the Germans countered the Dunkirk by laying down the Scharnhorst class. The Strasbourg had a thicker belt, which had a thickness of 283mm, an increase of the barbette armor to 340mm, and the turret armor increased to 360mm on the face, 355 on the rear, and 160mm on the roof. One interesting thing to contemplate here is that the French didn't see the need to design a new class to counter the Scharnhorst class ships, because in their belief, the Dunkerque class ships were designed to resist 280mm shell fire. However, had the Scharnhorst completed their upgun to 380mm, they would have posed a rather serious threat to the Dunkirks had they engaged in a fight. Underwater protection was excellent for the two Dunkerque class ships, consisting of a series of empty spaces, light bulkheads, liquid loading compartments, compartments filled with a special rubber-based water-excluding compound, and a heavy internal holding bulkhead to absorb an explosion. Interestingly enough, the Dunkerque class never went to sea with a full load of fuel. Had the fuel been filled to the brim, it would have increased the pressure on the bulkheads during a torpedo hit, rather than reducing the force of the explosion. This reduced the operating range to 7,850 nautical miles at 15 knots and 6,300 nautical miles at 20 knots. However, since the ship operated primarily in the Mediterranean, this was not a major problem. The protection system was put to the test and it performed relatively well, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Dunkerque class ships were really fast. As designed, the ships produced 107,000 shaft horsepower, pushing the ships to a maximum of 29.5 knots. During trials, however, the Dunkirk could manage 30 knots for at least 8 hours on 114,000 shaft horsepower. With 135,585 shaft horsepower, the Dunkirk could manage a pretty incredible 31.6 knots. Strasbourg was a little bit slower due to additional armor, but she still managed over 30 knots, and her absolute maximum was 30.9 knots on 131,960 shaft horsepower. The Dunkirks had great aviation facilities on board. There was a single 22-meter long catapult, which could launch a 3.5-ton aircraft to 103 kilometers an hour. Aircraft were made up of the Toulon 130 single-engine flying boats. The planes would land on water and be taken aboard the ship by crane. The aviation fuel was also stored in a safe manner, which included sprinkler systems and the replacement of fuel by an inert gas. That wraps up the technical aspects of the Dunkerque class. let's move on to their rather short service lives. The Dunkerque was commissioned April the 15th, 1937, and the Strasbourg followed on September the 15th, 1938. The Dunkerque represented France at the Naval Review of 1937 at Spithead, Portsmouth, to mark the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, which, interestingly enough, was also attended by the Admiral Graf Spee, which the sister ship to the Dunkerque, the Strasbourg, would be hunting in the early stages of World War II. By April 1939, the two ships combined to form the Première Division de Ligne, or the First Line Division. The ships could be differentiated by the number of white bands painted on the funnel, with the Dunkerque as the flagship having a single band, and the Strasbourg with two. They were under the command of Vice Admiral Marcel Gensoul. During the start of World War II saw the First Line Division, the 4th Cruiser Division, and 8 large destroyers sortying from Brest in an attempt to intercept German panzer ships. However, the reports of the German ships passing into the Atlantic were incorrect. The ships would eventually form hunting groups with Royal Navy warships in an effort to hunt down the German surface raiders. From October to November of 1939, the Strasbourg, along with other Royal Navy and French vessels, attempted to locate the Admiral Graf Spee, but were unsuccessful. The Dunkerque joined HMS Hood from November to December of 1939 in an attempt to hunt down the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. However, the Dunkerque suffered bow damage during an Atlantic storm and had to return to dock for repairs. In December of 1939, the Dunkerque was responsible for shipping a part of the Banque de France's gold to Canada. A few weeks before the German invasion of France, the Dunkerque and Strasbourg were transferred to the naval base in French Algeria at Mers-el-Kébir. This part of the story is both well known and is also incredibly interesting. As the German invasion of France progressed, Admiral Darlan told the British that the French fleet would never fall into the hands of the Germans. However, when France fell and the armistice was signed, the terms of surrender was met with dismay by the British. One of the terms was that the French vessels were to return to France and be disarmed. Unknown to the British, however, was the German concession at the last minute that the French ships would instead be disarmed at French African ports. This led the British to the belief that with the return of the French vessels to France that they would fall under the control of the Germans. The complete opposite, however, was to be true. Admiral Darlan had sent a coded order to all captains of warships in French African ports that their ships were to be scuttled if the Germans attempted to take control of them. However, the British, fearful of Nazi Germany's history of not respecting previous agreements, and the fear that the potential integration of the French Navy into the Kriegsmarine, which would have included multiple battleships, cruisers, and a large number of destroyers, would have instantly turned the Kriegsmarine into a much more dangerous threat to the Royal Navy. This strengthened German fleet, combined with the Italian fleet, would have swung the balance of naval power in Europe away from the Royal Navy. This led the British to create Force H on June the 28th of 1970. Force H, under the command of Vice Admiral James Somerville, consisted of HMS Hood, Resolution, Valiant, Ark Royal, and 11 destroyers. On the 1st of July 1940, Vice Admiral Somerville was given orders to secure the transfer, surrender, or destruction of the French warships in North Africa. At 6:30 a.m. on the morning of July 3, 1940, HMS Foxhound, with Captain Holland on board, steamed towards the harbor entrance. The captain was to orally deliver the ultimatum, which stated the following options: sail with the Royal Navy and continue the fight until victory against Germany, sail with reduced crews to a British port, the crews would be repatriated at the earliest moment. If any of these two courses of actions are taken, the British will restore the ships to the French at the end of the war, or pay full compensation if they are to be damaged. However, if you do not want French ships to be used against the Germans for fear of breaking the armistice and having France punished by the Germans, then sail with the Royal Navy to a French port in the West Indies and be demilitarized, or send them for safekeeping in the United States. If you refuse these offers, the Royal Navy will be forced to sink your ships in 6 hours to prevent them from falling into German hands. Admiral Gensoul took offense to the fact that the negotiations were not being conducted by a flag officer and refused to see Captain Holland. So at 8:10 a.m., Gensoul sent Lieutenant Dufay to convey to Holland that the French admiral would not be seeing him. During this time, Gensoul was also getting increasingly agitated that the British were trying to conduct diplomacy at gunpoint, and at 8:47 a.m. ordered HMS Foxhound to leave the harbor immediately. Captain Holland, understanding what would happen if negotiations failed, boarded a fast launch as the Foxhound was leaving the harbor, hoping to get on board Gensoul's flagship, the Dunkerque. He was met once again by Lieutenant Dufay in another craft, who explained once more that the French admiral would not see Holland. In desperation, Captain Holland handed the flag lieutenant a briefcase containing the text of the British ultimatum. Gensoul read the British demands, and at 9:45 a.m. he signaled the French Admiralty in Toulon, informing them that a British force was stationed outside the harbor and had issued an ultimatum, and that if he did not comply, the British would sink his ships in 6 hours. While Gensoul sent the message to the French Admiralty, he failed to send all the conditions laid out in the ultimatum in full. This would prove to be a costly mistake. The French Admiralty, which was unaware that there was an option to sail the ships to the United States for safekeeping, responded by signaling other French squadrons to prepare for action and to reinforce Gensoul's squadron. This message was intercepted by the British and passed on to the First Sea Lord and Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. At around 10 a.m., Somerville received a message from Gensoul that the French warships would resist any forcible attempt to gain control of the fleet. Somerville notified the British Admiralty that he was prepared to take action at 1:30 p.m. that afternoon. A little after noon, Gensoul sent another message to the Admiralty with more details about the ultimatum, but it received no immediate response. During this time, Captain Holland noticed that the French ships were starting to raise steam, indicating a possible attempt at escape. This led to Admiral Somerville to order the main shipping channel of Mers-el-Kébir to be mined. At 1:15 p.m., with the deadline drawing nearer, Somerville signaled to Gensoul to accept one of the conditions or he would open fire. Gensoul replied that he was still awaiting a response from the French Admiralty. This extended the deadline to 3:30 p.m. At around this time, Gensoul received a message from the French Admiralty to not demobilize as reinforcements were on the way. And as the deadline approached, Gensoul signaled that he would instead talk to Captain Holland in person. This led to another 2-hour extension as a peaceful settlement was hoped for. Further negotiations took place, but very little was accomplished. The French would not comply, and to the British it looked like the French admiral was stalling for time. At 5 p.m., Captain Holland signaled Admiral Somerville of the inability to reach a settlement. Somerville, which had 15 minutes earlier received a message from the British Admiralty notifying him to settle matters quickly or you will have reinforcements to deal with. Somerville signaled to Gensoul that if none of the proposals were accepted by 5:30 p.m., then he would open fire. Gensoul received the message and showed it to Captain Holland. The French admiral then stood up, nodded to Captain Holland, and walked out of the room. A disappointed Captain Holland somberly disembarked at Dunkirk at 5:25 p.m. The officer of the watch on the Bretagne saluted Holland as he passed. Gensoul climbed aboard the bridge of the Dunkirk and said, "I've done everything to gain time. Now it's finished." As 5:30 came and passed, Admiral Somerville continued to hold his fire, hoping that the French would surrender. But as 6 o'clock approached, he ordered his ships to open fire. The French battleship Bretagne would explode after taking a hit in the magazine, taking 977 crew with her. The Dunkirk was hit by 4 381mm shells in rapid succession. The first shot hit the upper 330mm turret, knocking out the right half of the turret, killing all of the crew there, although the left half did remain operational. The second shot damaged the aircraft installations, and the last 2 shells passed clean through the 225mm armor belt, which was not designed to resist shellfire from 381mm shells. The first shot of the 2 damaged the forward turbine room, and the other hitting boiler room number 2, causing massive damage. This resulted in the Dunkirk being beached. The Strasbourg managed to get underway, and through the smoke and chaos managed to break out to sea with a few destroyers. They managed to escape the British and make it to Toulon. The action on July the 3rd of 1940 lasted less than 20 minutes, after which 1,297 French sailors were killed. About 350 were wounded. Admiral Somerville commented that this was the biggest political blunder of modern times. We all feel thoroughly ashamed. The Dunkirk, however, wasn't all that badly damaged, and this led to the British to conduct another attack on the 6th of July. This attack involving torpedo bombers, and one of the torpedo bombers managed to hit a small patrol ship moored next to the Dunkirk, which was carrying a load of depth charges. These charges exploded with a force of roughly 8 airdrop torpedoes. It ripped a pretty massive hole in the Dunkirk's hull and killed a further 40 sailors. However, the torpedo protection system of the ship worked well enough to prevent the ship from being a total loss. Repair work commenced, and by early 1942, the Dunkirk was repaired enough to depart Mers-el-Kébir and head for Toulon to join up with the Strasbourg. On November the 27th of 1942, the thing that the British had feared when they undertook the attack on Mers-el-Kébir took place as the Germans attempted to seize control of what was left of the French Navy at Toulon. As the Germans approached at 5:25 a.m., the Strasbourg immediately transmitted the order scuttle, scuttle, scuttle to all French ships using radio, visual signals, and dispatch boats. As German tanks rolled through, the Strasbourg opened fire with a secondary armament, which brought a rapid halt to the German advance. As the Strasbourg settled to the bottom, her captain ordered the demolition charges to be set off. The main armament and vital machinery were totally destroyed. The Strasbourg was a total loss. The Dunkerque's captain, whose ship was in dry dock at the time, refused to scuttle his ship, but was eventually convinced to do so by another captain. The attempt by the Germans to capture the French fleet was an utter failure. The French managed to destroy 77 ships in all, including 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. In the aftermath of this final action by the Strasbourg and the Dunkerque, Admiral Darlan wrote to Churchill, "Prime Minister, you said to me, 'I hope you will never surrender the fleet,' to which I replied, 'There is no question of doing so.' It seems to me you did not believe my word. The destruction of the fleet at Toulon has just proved that I was right." And that's all, folks, for this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this story. And of course, if you want to see more like it, don't forget to like this video and sub to my channel. Aside from all that, I hope you all take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.